The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence as Niccolò Machiavelli adjusted his worn cloak against the autumn chill of 1513. His footsteps echoed hollowly on the cobblestones, a sound that had become all too familiar in the months since his fall from grace. Once the most trusted advisor to the Florentine Republic, now he was little more than a political exile, stripped of his position, his influence, and his dignity by the returning Medici family. As he walked through the marketplace, Machiavelli could feel the eyes upon him, some filled with pity, others with barely concealed contempt. Whispered conversations would halt abruptly as he passed, only to resume in hushed, mocking tones once he was beyond immediate earshot. The transformation from respected statesman to object of derision had been swift and merciless, a reminder of how quickly fortune's will could turn in the treacherous world of Renaissance politics. It was during this period of profound humiliation that Machiavelli would develop one of his most counterintuitive and powerful insights about human nature and the mechanics of power. The insight would not emerge from the comfort of his former office or the confidence of his previous authority, but from the crucible of mockery, dismissal, and social ostracism that defined his new reality. Part 1: The Anatomy of Mockery and Its Hidden Power. The first lesson came to Machiavelli not through scholarly contemplation but through lived experience. One particularly humiliating afternoon, as he attempted to purchase bread from a vendor who had once eagerly sought his favor, the man openly laughed at Machiavelli's request for credit. The great political theorist, the baker sneered, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, who couldn't even predict his own downfall, now begs for bread like a common vagrant. The laughter that followed was not merely cruel, it was instructive. Machiavelli, rather than retreating in shame as many would have done, stood perfectly still and observed. He watched the faces of those who laughed, studied their expressions, noted who joined in eagerly and who seemed uncomfortable with the public humiliation. In that moment of acute social pain, he began to understand something profound about the nature of mockery and its relationship to power. Mockery, he realized, was not simply an expression of superiority or casual cruelty. It was a fundamental mechanism of social control, a way for groups to establish and maintain hierarchies without resorting to physical violence or formal institutions. When people mocked him, they were not merely expressing their opinion of his current circumstances, they were participating in a collective ritual of exclusion that served to reinforce their own position within the social order. But Machiavelli's insight went deeper than this surface observation. As he continued to experience mockery day after day, he began to notice patterns that would fundamentally change his understanding of human psychology and political dynamics. The people who mocked him most viciously were not always those who had the most reason to despise him, nor were they necessarily those who benefited most from his downfall. Instead, they were often individuals who had previously been uncertain of their own social standing, people who used his humiliation as an opportunity to elevate themselves by comparison. The baker who had mocked him so publicly, for instance, had always been a marginal figure in Florentine society, neither wealthy enough to command respect through prosperity nor skilled enough to earn it through craft. But, in that moment of collective derision, he had transformed himself temporarily from a peripheral figure into a central one, the focal point around which the crowd's attention organized itself. By leading the mockery, he had claimed a kind of authority that his normal circumstances would never have afforded him. This observation led Machiavelli to a startling conclusion: mockery was not a sign of the mocker's strength but of their weakness. It was a tool used by those who lacked other forms of power to create the illusion of dominance. The more vicious the mockery, the more desperate the mockers need to establish their superiority over the target. As weeks turned to months, Machiavelli began to experiment with different responses to the mockery he encountered. When he reacted with anger or defensiveness, the mockery intensified, as if his emotional response validated the mocker's sense of power over him. When he ignored it entirely, the mockery often escalated as well, with mockers seeming to interpret his silence as either weakness or disdain that required more aggressive challenging. But, when he responded with a particular kind of calculated acknowledgement, neither defensive nor dismissive, but observational, something interesting happened. He would look directly at his mockers, study them with the same clinical interest he had once applied to diplomatic negotiations, and occasionally offer a slight nod of recognition, as if acknowledging their performance rather than their criticism. This response proved deeply unsettling to those who mocked him. The baker, after several such encounters, began to avoid eye contact entirely. Other frequent mockers seemed to lose enthusiasm for their ridicule, as if Machiavelli's studied attention had somehow stripped the pleasure from their performance. What had once felt like a demonstration of power began to feel more like a revelation of their own psychological needs and insecurities. Through these experiences, Machiavelli developed what would become one of his most powerful insights into the nature of social dynamics. The person being mocked often possessed more actual power in the interaction than the person doing the mocking, provided they understood how to leverage that power correctly. The key lay in recognizing that mockery was fundamentally a form of attention, and attention was always a form of power. When someone mocked him, they were dedicating their mental and emotional energy to him, making him the center of their consciousness even as they claimed to dismiss him. They were, in essence, granting him a form of rent-free residence in their minds, allowing his existence to shape their behavior and emotional state. But, more importantly, Machiavelli realized that mockery often revealed far more about the mocker than about the target. In their choice of insults, their particular areas of focus, their emotional investment in the act of ridicule, mockers inadvertently exposed their own fears, insecurities, and desires. The baker's focus on Machiavelli's inability to predict his own downfall revealed his own anxiety about his lack of foresight and planning in his own life. Others who mocked his current poverty revealed their own deep-seated fears about financial security and social status. This revelation transformed mockery from a source of pain into a source of invaluable intelligence. Every insult became a window into the insulter's psychology, every cruel joke a roadmap to their vulnerabilities. Machiavelli began to keep mental notes on the specific nature of the mockery he encountered, cataloging the fears and insecurities that different individuals revealed through their choice of ridicule. The third and, perhaps most crucial insight came when Machiavelli realized that the very act of mocking someone created a psychological investment in that person's continued failure. Once someone had publicly ridiculed another, they became emotionally invested in being proven right. They needed their target to remain defeated, humiliated, and unsuccessful, because the target's recovery would retroactively make them appear cruel, short-sighted, or simply wrong. This created what Machiavelli would later describe as a reverse dependency. The mockers, despite their apparent position of superiority, actually became dependent on their target's continued degradation for their own psychological comfort. They had to continue paying attention to their target, had to keep investing mental energy in monitoring their circumstances, had to remain vigilant for any signs of recovery that might threaten the narrative they had constructed. In this way, sustained mockery created a form of psychological bondage that trapped the mocker far more than the mocked. The mocked person, once they understood this dynamic, could choose when and how to engage with this attention. They could leverage their mocker's psychological investment for their own purposes, or they could simply ignore it and focus their energy elsewhere. But, the mockers, having committed themselves to a narrative of superiority based on another's inferiority, found themselves unable to disengage without admitting error or changing their entire understanding of the situation. Machiavelli tested this theory through careful observation of long-term social dynamics in Florence. He watched as individuals who had built their sense of identity around mocking others became increasingly anxious and defensive when their targets showed signs of recovery. He saw successful people become obsessed with the failures of those they had previously dismissed, unable to enjoy their own success because they remained fixated on preventing others' recovery. The implications of this insight were profound. It suggested that sustained mockery was not a position of strength but a form of self-imposed weakness, a psychological trap that bound the mocker to their target more thoroughly than any external constraint. It meant that those who were mocked, rather than being powerless victims, actually held a form of psychological leverage over their mockers that they could exploit if they understood the dynamics at play. But, perhaps most importantly, it revealed that the appropriate response to mockery was not to escape from it or to fight against it, but to understand and leverage the power dynamics it created. The mocked person who understood these principles could transform their apparent weakness into actual strength, their humiliation into intelligence, and their social exclusion into psychological advantage. This understanding would form the foundation of Machiavelli's approach to dealing with mockery, an approach that would prove both personally liberating and strategically effective. But, before he could fully implement these insights, he would need to understand the second crucial element of the equation, the proper timing and method for response. Part 2, the strategic response, timing, method, and psychological warfare. The winter of 1513 brought not just cold winds to Florence but a deepening of Machiavelli's social exile. The initial mockery he had endured had crystallized into a more systematic form of exclusion. Former colleagues crossed streets to avoid him, his letters went unanswered, and invitations that had once been routine were no longer extended. Yet rather than breaking him, this intensification of his ostracism provided him with the perfect laboratory for testing his emerging theories about the strategic response to mockery and social rejection. It was during this period that Machiavelli made his second crucial discovery, the power of strategic patience. Most people, when mocked or humiliated, felt compelled to respond immediately, driven by wounded pride and the natural human desire to defend oneself. But Machiavelli had learned through painful experience that immediate responses, no matter how clever or cutting, almost always strengthened the position of the mockers rather than weakening it. The reason for this was psychological rather than logical. When someone responded immediately to mockery, they validated the premise that the mockery was important enough to warrant a response. They demonstrated that their emotional state was dependent on the opinions of their mockers, and they provided fresh material for additional ridicule in the form of their defensive reactions. Most importantly, they surrendered the advantage of choosing the time, place, and manner of engagement to their opponents. Machiavelli's approach was radically different. Instead of responding to mockery when it occurred, he began to study it as a scholar might study a natural phenomenon. He observed who initiated mockery, who joined in, who remained silent, and how the dynamics changed over time. He noted which of his former associates seemed most eager to participate in his humiliation and which seemed uncomfortable with it. He tracked how his mockers' behavior changed depending on who was present to witness it and how their mockery evolved as his circumstances remained unchanged. This period of observation revealed several crucial insights that would inform his strategic response. First, he noticed that mockery followed predictable patterns, with certain individuals consistently playing specific roles: the initiator, the amplifier, the reluctant participant, the secret sympathizer. Second, he observed that the intensity of mockery tended to decrease over time if not reinforced by responses from the target. People grew bored with ridicule that generated no reaction, and moved on to other sources of entertainment. But, most importantly, he discovered that his mockers were revealing detailed intelligence about their own psychology, motivations, and vulnerabilities through their sustained attention to his circumstances. Giovanni Salviati, a minor noble who had been among the most vocal in mocking Machiavelli's fall, consistently focused his ridicule on themes of loyalty and betrayal. Through careful observation, Machiavelli realized that Salviati was projecting his own guilt about having switched allegiances from the Republic to the Medici at the first sign of political change. The viciousness of his attacks on Machiavelli's unreliability was directly proportional to his own shame about his opportunistic abandonment of his previous principles. Similarly, Francesco Vettori, once a close friend and now a distant acquaintance who participated in subtle forms of social exclusion, revealed through his specific avoidances and careful neutral comments his deep anxiety about his own security under the new regime. His distancing from Machiavelli was not based on disapproval but on fear that association with a known Republican sympathizer might compromise his own position. Armed with these insights, Machiavelli began to craft what he would later describe as his strategic response to sustained mockery and social exclusion. This response had three components: controlled revelation, selective engagement, and psychological reversal. Controlled revelation involved the careful, strategic disclosure of information or insights that would demonstrate his continued relevance and intellectual power without appearing to seek validation or approval. Rather than defending his past actions or current circumstances, he would occasionally offer observations about current political developments that proved both accurate and valuable. These observations were not offered as attempts to regain status or favor, but as natural expressions of his continuing analytical capabilities. For example, when the Medici faced their first significant political challenge from rival factions within Florence, Machiavelli made a casual comment to a mutual acquaintance about the likely outcome based on his understanding of the personalities involved. When events unfolded exactly as he had predicted, word spread quietly through Florence's political circles that despite his current circumstances, his analytical powers remained formidable. This created a subtle shift in how he was perceived, from a defeated politician to a potentially valuable intellectual resource. Selective engagement meant choosing very carefully when, where, and with whom to break his pattern of observational silence. Machiavelli did not respond to all mockery or engage with all mockers equally. Instead, he identified specific individuals whose psychological profiles made them particularly susceptible to certain types of pressure or influence, and he crafted individualized approaches for each. With Giovanni Salviati, who had revealed his deep insecurities about loyalty through his pattern of mockery, Machiavelli chose a moment of public gathering to make a seemingly casual comment about the importance of consistency in character, noting how some men change their principles with their circumstances, while others remain constant even in adversity. The comment was not directly addressed to Salviati and was delivered in a tone of philosophical musing rather than personal attack, but its target understood the implication perfectly. Salviati's mockery of Machiavelli ceased immediately, replaced by a nervous avoidance that itself spoke volumes to observant witnesses. With Francesco Vettori, Machiavelli employed a different strategy entirely. Understanding that Vettori's distancing was based on fear rather than contempt, he sent a carefully crafted letter that acknowledged their changed circumstances without resentment, expressed understanding of the political pressures Vettori faced, and included some genuinely valuable insights about developments in Rome that might affect Florentine politics. The letter was written in a tone that assumed continued friendship while respecting necessary distance, and it reminded Vettori of the intellectual value of their past exchanges without explicitly requesting renewed contact. The result was exactly what Machiavelli had calculated. Vettori, reassured that association with Machiavelli would not create political risk and, reminded of the intellectual benefits of their friendship, began gradually to re-establish contact. More importantly, his shift from avoidance to cautious re-engagement was noticed by others, creating a subtle change in the social dynamics surrounding Machiavelli's ostracism. But the third element of Machiavelli's strategy, psychological reversal, was perhaps the most sophisticated and effective. This involved the gradual transformation of the power dynamics between himself and his mockers through the careful manipulation of their psychological investment in his failure. Machiavelli had realized that his mockers needed him to remain defeated and humiliated for their own psychological comfort. They had constructed their sense of superiority, their social position, and their personal narrative around his continued failure. This created an opportunity for what he termed reverse dependency manipulation, making his mockers dependent on his choices about how to present himself and respond to their behavior. The implementation of this strategy was subtle but devastating. Machiavelli began to control the narrative around his circumstances through careful management of information and appearances. Rather than allowing his mockers to define his situation for him, he began to define it for them in ways that served his purposes rather than theirs. When rumors circulated about his financial difficulties, he neither confirmed nor denied them but instead made oblique references to the interesting perspective that poverty provides on human nature and the educational value of experiencing different stations in life. This framing transformed apparent weakness into chosen philosophical experience, making his circumstances appear deliberate rather than unfortunate. When his exclusion from political circles was mocked, he began to refer to his freedom from the constraints of office and his ability to observe political dynamics without the distorting influence of personal stake in their outcomes. Again, this transformed apparent rejection into chosen independence, making his exclusion appear strategic rather than imposed. But, most effectively, he began to demonstrate through his behavior and comments that he was studying his mockers with the same analytical attention he had once applied to foreign diplomats and rival politicians. He would look at them with obvious interest, take notes after conversations, and occasionally make comments that revealed his understanding of their motivations and psychology. This shift had a profound psychological impact on those who had been mocking him. They began to feel that rather than being the observers of his humiliation, they had become the subjects of his observation. Rather than controlling the narrative about his circumstances, they found themselves wondering what narrative he was constructing about theirs. The comfortable sense of superiority that had motivated their mockery was gradually replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of being analyzed and judged by someone whose analytical capabilities they had previously respected. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Conversations that had once been dominated by casual ridicule of Machiavelli became cautious discussions about what he might be thinking or planning. People who had once felt free to mock him openly began to moderate their comments, uncertain about how their words might be interpreted or used. The psychological dynamic had reversed. Instead of Machiavelli being at the mercy of their opinions, they had become concerned about his opinion of them. This reversal created opportunities for more direct forms of influence and leverage. People who were worried about how they appeared in Machiavelli's analysis became more responsive to subtle suggestions and influences. Former mockers who had become uncertain about their own position relative to him became more willing to consider small gestures of reconciliation or respect. The entire social dynamic that had supported his ostracism began to shift as individuals recalculated the costs and benefits of their participation in his exclusion. But, perhaps most importantly, this strategic approach to dealing with mockery and exclusion taught Machiavelli something profound about the nature of social power itself. True power, he realized, was not the ability to avoid being mocked or rejected. Circumstances could always make anyone vulnerable to such treatment. True power was the ability to control how mockery and rejection affected you, and how you could leverage the psychology of mockers and rejectors for your own purposes. This insight would prove crucial not just for his personal recovery from his political fall, but for his understanding of political dynamics more generally. The same principles that allowed him to transform his personal humiliation into strategic advantage could be applied to larger questions of political power, social control, and human motivation. But, before these broader applications could be fully developed, he would need to test his theories in the most challenging arena of all, his attempt to return to political relevance despite everything that had been done to exclude him. Part 3, The Restoration of Power, From Mockery to Mastery. The spring of 1515 marked the beginning of what would become Machiavelli's most audacious experiment in the practical application of his theories about mockery, power, and human psychology. Having spent nearly 2 years observing, analyzing, and subtly manipulating the social dynamics of his exclusion, he was ready to attempt something that seemed impossible to most observers: the restoration of his political relevance despite the complete destruction of his former position and the sustained campaign of ridicule and exclusion he had endured. The opportunity came in the form of Leo X's ascension to the papacy. Giovanni de' Medici, now Pope, represented a potential shift in the political landscape that might create openings for those who had been excluded under the previous arrangements. But, approaching this opportunity required extraordinary delicacy. Machiavelli could not appear to be desperately seeking rehabilitation, nor could he ignore the network of enemies and mockers who would be watching for any sign of failure that would vindicate their treatment of him. His strategy began with what he privately termed the demonstration of indifference to the thing desired. Rather than seeking an audience with papal representatives or lobbying for position through traditional channels, Machiavelli began work on what would eventually become The Prince, a treatise on political power that demonstrated his intellectual capabilities while appearing to be simply an academic exercise with no immediate practical application. The psychological effect of this approach was precisely what his analysis of human nature had predicted. Those who had invested themselves in his continued failure found themselves in the uncomfortable position of watching him produce work of obvious intellectual merit while showing no apparent concern for their opinions about it. The very people who had mocked his political irrelevance now found themselves confronted with evidence of his intellectual relevance that they could neither dismiss nor ignore. More importantly, the content of The Prince served a dual purpose. On its surface, it was a serious academic work that demonstrated his continued analytical capabilities and his deep understanding of political dynamics. But, on a deeper level, it was a subtle form of psychological warfare directed at those who had participated in his exclusion and the systems that had supported it. The treatise's famous analysis of how princes should deal with those who had wronged them, its discussions of the proper response to betrayal and ingratitude, and its detailed examination of how political fortunes could be reversed through intelligence and strategic action, all served as indirect commentary on his own circumstances and those who had contributed to them. But, because these insights were presented in the form of general political principles rather than personal grievances, they could not be dismissed as bitter complaints or threats of revenge. The effect on his former colleagues and mockers was profound. Francesco Vettori, who had by this point cautiously re-established some contact with Machiavelli, reported privately to friends that reading The Prince made him deeply uncomfortable because of its implications for those who had failed to show proper loyalty to fallen friends. Others who had participated in Machiavelli's exclusion found themselves wondering whether specific passages were directed at them and what implications the work's analysis might have for their own future security. But, the true genius of Machiavelli's approach became apparent when word of his treatise reached Rome and began circulating among papal advisors. Rather than being seen as the desperate attempt of a fallen politician to regain relevance, it was recognized as a serious work of political analysis that might have practical value for the current regime. The same qualities that had made him valuable as a diplomatic advisor, his analytical intelligence, his understanding of human motivation, his ability to see through surface appearances to underlying dynamics, were clearly displayed in the work, but now enhanced by the additional perspective that came from having experienced political failure personally. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, Leo X's cousin and one of his most trusted advisors, reportedly commented that Machiavelli's fall from favor appears to have sharpened rather than dulled his understanding of political realities. This represented exactly the kind of reframing that Machiavelli had been working to achieve, his apparent weakness being transformed into actual strength, his humiliation being reinterpreted as education, his exclusion being seen as an opportunity for valuable perspective rather than simple punishment. The psychological transformation of his mockers during this period provided a fascinating confirmation of his theories about the nature of sustained ridicule and its effects on those who practiced it. Giovanni Salviati, who had been among the most vocal in mocking Machiavelli's irrelevance, now found himself in the deeply uncomfortable position of acknowledging the obvious quality of work being produced by someone he had dismissed as finished. His previous mockery made it impossible for him to openly praise Machiavelli without implicitly admitting his own poor judgment, but the quality of the work made it equally impossible for him to continue his ridicule without appearing foolish. The result was a kind of psychological paralysis in which Salviati found himself unable to speak about Machiavelli at all. His previous investment in Machiavelli's failure had trapped him in a position where any acknowledgement of Machiavelli's intellectual merit would be a confession of his own error, but continued ridicule would make him appear increasingly out of touch with reality. He had become a prisoner of his own mockery, exactly as Machiavelli's analysis had predicted. Others who had participated in the campaign of exclusion and ridicule found themselves in similar positions. Their psychological investment in Machiavelli's continued failure made it difficult for them to adapt to evidence of his recovery and continued relevance. Some doubled down on their hostility, becoming increasingly shrill and desperate in their attempts to dismiss his work. Others simply withdrew from any discussion of him at all, unable to reconcile their previous mockery with current reality. But, perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a third group, those who began to position themselves as having always recognized Machiavelli's talent and having never fully participated in the unfair treatment he received. These individuals, motivated by a desire to be associated with his apparent recovery rather than his previous failure, began to actively promote his rehabilitation and to distance themselves from those who continued to oppose it. This development revealed another crucial insight about the psychology of mockery and exclusion. Just as people could become invested in someone's continued failure, they could equally become invested in someone's success if they believed it was inevitable and if they could position themselves as supporters rather than opponents. The key was creating the perception of momentum and inevitability around one's recovery. Machiavelli achieved this through careful management of information and expectations. Rather than overselling his prospects or making dramatic claims about his returning influence, he allowed others to observe and interpret the evidence of his continued intellectual vitality. He let the quality of his work speak for itself while maintaining the same analytical detachment that had characterized his response to mockery. This approach made his recovery appear natural and inevitable rather than desperate or calculated. When the opportunity finally came for direct engagement with the Medici regime, a request for advice on certain political matters affecting Florentine territory, Machiavelli was ready. His response was masterful, demonstrating not only his unchanged analytical capabilities but also the additional wisdom that came from having experienced both success and failure, both inclusion and exclusion, both respect and mockery. The advice he provided proved both accurate and valuable, leading to successful resolution of the problems under consideration. More importantly, it established a new dynamic between him and those in power. Rather than being a supplicant seeking rehabilitation, he was now positioned as a valuable resource whose insights were sought because of their quality rather than provided because of his need for acceptance. The transformation of his social position was gradual but unmistakable. Former mockers found themselves in the awkward position of having to interact professionally with someone they had previously ridiculed. Many discovered that their past behavior had created an uncomfortable dynamic in which they were never quite sure whether Machiavelli remembered their mockery and how it might affect his attitude toward them. This uncertainty worked to Machiavelli's advantage in ways that confirmed his deepest insights about the nature of social power. People who were unsure about his opinion of them became more deferential and careful in their interactions with him. Those who felt guilty about their previous treatment became more eager to demonstrate their current respect and cooperation. The psychological investment that his mockers had made in his failure had created debts that could now be leveraged for various forms of consideration and support. But, perhaps the most profound aspect of Machiavelli's restoration was how it demonstrated the practical application of his insights about the relationship between individual psychology and political power. His personal experience of mockery and exclusion had taught him truths about human nature that could be applied not just to personal relationships but to larger questions of governance and social control. The same psychological mechanisms that had initially worked against him, the human tendency to mock and exclude those who appeared weak, the psychological investment that people made in others' failure, the way that sustained attention to someone's circumstances created dependency even when it appeared to create power, could be understood and leveraged by anyone who grasped their underlying dynamics. His restoration was not simply a personal victory but a demonstration of how apparent weakness could be transformed into actual strength through proper understanding of psychological dynamics. It showed how someone who understood the true nature of mockery and exclusion could leverage these experiences for strategic advantage rather than simply enduring them as unavoidable suffering. The implications extended far beyond his individual circumstances. If a single person could transform mockery into strategic intelligence, exclusion into psychological advantage, and apparent defeat into eventual victory through proper understanding of human psychology, what possibilities existed for leaders who could apply these same insights to larger political and social challenges? This question would drive the next phase of Machiavelli's work, as he began to explore how his personal insights about the nature of power, mockery, and human psychology could be systematized into broader principles of governance and social control. His experience had taught him that true power was not the ability to avoid being mocked or challenged, but the ability to understand and leverage the psychology of those who mocked and challenged you. The restoration of his political relevance was thus not an end in itself but a validation of a deeper understanding about the nature of power and human relationships. It demonstrated that those who truly understood psychology could transform any apparent weakness into actual strength, any apparent defeat into strategic advantage, and any form of social exclusion into leverage for future influence. In the end, Machiavelli's response to sustained mockery had taught him something that would become central to his entire political philosophy, that the appearance of power and the reality of power were often completely different things, and that those who understood this difference could exercise influence far beyond what their apparent circumstances might suggest was possible. The mockers who had thought they were demonstrating their superiority over him had instead provided him with the education in human psychology that would make him one of the most influential political thinkers in human history. His dark insight about mockery, that it revealed more about the mocker than the mocked, that it created psychological dependencies that could be leveraged by those who understood them, and that it could be transformed from a source of weakness into a source of strategic advantage, would influence not just his personal recovery but his entire approach to understanding power, influence, and human nature. Years later, when reflecting on this period of his life, Machiavelli would write that those who mock others reveal their own fears, and those who understand this revelation hold power over their mockers that their mockers can never hold over them. It was a lesson learned not through academic study but through the painful and ultimately educational experience of being mocked, excluded, and dismissed by those who thought they were demonstrating their superiority. The transformation from mocked exile to influential advisor had required patience, intelligence, and psychological sophistication, but, most importantly, it had required the counterintuitive insight that mockery was often a source of power for those who knew how to use it properly. In learning to leverage the psychology of his mockers for his own advantage, Machiavelli had discovered principles about human nature and social dynamics that would prove applicable to challenges far beyond his personal circumstances. His restoration was thus both a personal triumph and an intellectual achievement, proof that proper understanding of human psychology could transform any apparent weakness into strategic advantage, and any form of social attack into useful intelligence about those who launched it. The mockers who had thought they were destroying him had instead provided him with the insights that would make him immortal.